I will talk about the multiple crises that we are facing simultaneously. We talk, of course, about COVID-19, but there is a conjunction of crises that may sometimes compound each other. We are off track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. We are facing a changing climate, and on top of that, of course, increasing water stress. So in my presentation, I will touch on each of these four crises and the interactions among them. As you know, starting with COVID-19, the East Asia and the Pacific region was the first region to be affected. And we were hoping that it would be the first region to come out of the crisis, but this is unfortunately not quite happening, at least not everywhere. There are repeated successive waves of the virus, and the latest one, Omicron, is only now really starting to hit the region. Over the past couple of years, the region has suffered very severe human capital losses. Just think of all the children who have not been able to go to school, all the women who've lost their jobs, all the vulnerable people around the world who have become even more vulnerable. I am reminded of friends and colleagues in the Philippines where schools are still closed. It's really, really hard. Obviously, economies have registered very deep contractions. The tourism sector is one that has contracted a lot in countries like Thailand, in Cambodia, but all the Pacific Islands. Countries have become more indebted. And unfortunately, we have now seen, again, if there was any need for it, that our traditional development models are truly unsustainable and unjust. And COVID-19, as a result, has affected the poor even more. Now, linking this to water, there has been an increase in the use of water, generally speaking. And of course, there have been a few exceptions to that. In particular, as I said, the tourism sector, because it has contracted so much, it has used less water. But we have become acutely aware of the importance, the interlinkages between water, health, and development. Clearly, better hygiene is necessary, and water for that is essential. But then, as we were just discussing in the breakout room, other aspects of the water sector have become very clear, in particular, the viability and the fragility of water utilities that are responsible for delivering clean water. These companies were often already quite fragile before COVID, and now with a customer base that is less even able to pay, it is very, very challenging for these utilities to remain solvent. Now, turning to the Sustainable Development Goals, water is needed for almost all of them, but focusing on SDG 6, which is really about clean water, the numbers are really not pretty. 2 billion people still lacking safely managed drinking water services. 3.6 billion, almost half of the world's population, lack safely managed sanitation services. Almost 500 million people still practice open defecation. And the list goes on. So there is still so much to be done for countries to meet their commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, Sustainable Development Goal number 6. Turning to climate change, there is some hope that with the Glasgow conference just completed, the commitments of countries may get us closer to where we need to be to limit temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius. That is what the Paris Agreement provided for. But unfortunately, looking at what at the levels of emissions of the countries projected for 2030, just 8 years from now, you see on the left-hand side, there's a very significant ambition gap. Countries say they will become carbon neutral in the future, but far away. Meanwhile, 2030 is really the year, around the year where emissions ought to decrease very, very fast. And we will not be there. In 2030, we will still be far, far above where we need to be to reach this green trajectory on the left-hand side. And we know that most of the efforts need to be deployed in the energy sector primarily, secondarily in the agriculture, forestry, and land use, and of course in some other sectors, industry, transport, etc. Now, as I was saying, water is becoming more and more stressed in general. You see on the left-hand side, the rather exponential shape of the blue curve, that is population, but then the even more exponential shape of the red curve, which is water withdrawals. So what has happened starting in the 1950s is that, of course, population grew and faster, but that population became more and more demanding in terms of its water uses. And with climate change, this increase is predicted to continue well into the next decades. And unfortunately, as you can see,
ต้องเฝ้าของให้พ่อ พ่อฝากของไว้
I'm not sure if this was a message for me or not, but as I was saying, as you see on the right-hand side, the story today and tomorrow is one of the crisis, really, of either too much and or too little and or too dirty water. There is already in many areas of the world, you see in yellow here, a level of water stress which is significant. That is going to be compounded by droughts in the future, you see in the red colored map. And then in many places, sometimes the same places, you have also flood risks. So it can be really confusing that countries such as Thailand, such as Cambodia, can at different times of the year face water shortages and then water excesses causing floods and major damage. And indeed, climate impacts are already being felt around the world. You see the very significant numbers here in terms of people and economic damages between 2019, so the past 20 years or so. 1.65 billion people adversely affected by floods, and about the same amount by droughts. $764 billion, which represents about $110 billion per year, when you add also, the second amount. So you see $64 billion in recorded damages, and then linked to floods and droughts, and 1.4 trillion from storm-related floods alone. So very, very significant. This is not the future, this is the recent past. So no wonder then that major investments are needed to tackle all the challenges that present themselves. Protecting the poorest, buffering the economy, investing in resilience, and preparing for macro level impacts. You see the amounts that are needed, $150 billion annually to deliver safe water and sanitation, almost $1 trillion required for irrigation by 2050. And meanwhile, $14 billion are wasted each year simply because water is being wasted. And unfortunately, meanwhile, you see on the right-hand side that the water supply and sanitation sector is a tiny, tiny fraction, just about 1% of commercial finance mobilized by development. So that means the private sector needs to do a whole lot more, but the public sector as well needs to step up its investments in for the water sector. Let me now spend a few minutes telling you a little bit about the World Bank Group response to the climate crisis, and also after that, what we do in the water sector. So we have a climate change action plan, which summarizes our corporate commitments across the public sector and the private sector arms of the World Bank Group. And not surprisingly, we've identified 4 key transitions: energy, agriculture, food, water, and land, cities and transport, and manufacturing. And in all these 4 transitions, we aim to contribute to systems changes, to systems transformations or transitions. We are strengthening our analytical capacity through so-called country climate and development reports. I'm going to talk about them in a second. And we plan to mobilize, on average, 35% of our total financing for climate action, either mitigation or adaptation. And we hope that we will be able to achieve parity between the amount that is dedicated to climate change mitigation and adaptation. These country climate and development reports aim to bring into the mainstream of our development, finance and development policy advice, all the relevant aspects of climate action, both mitigation and, of course, adaptation. This we hope is going to be based on rigorous analysis, both at the sectoral level, but also at the macroeconomic level. So we're now modifying the models that we use, the economic models, microeconomic and macroeconomic, to reflect the cost of climate action. And we hope that we will be better equipped to inform the dialogue that we conduct with countries, so that countries can realize their development objectives while at the same time protecting themselves against climate change and variability and contributing their fair share of the global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. With respect to our response to the water crisis, as I've mentioned, we realize that water underpins most sustainable development goals. And so we are structuring our actions around three main pillars that you see here: sustaining water resources, delivering services, and building resilience. By sustaining water resources, we mean expanding beyond managing the resource to focus now on sustaining this resource for the current and future generations. Delivering services encompasses water and sanitation, obviously, but also water for, say, agriculture. So all the sectors that depend on water need to have their fair share in the context of overall diminishing supply. And the third pillar is about building resilience, recognizing the link between water and fragility and conflict, while also, of course, considering the need to build resilience to climate change and pandemics such as COVID-19. So you see the numbers. We have a very large portfolio, including about $4 billion in the region. And the objective of all of this is to tackle the multiple water sector challenges in a coordinated way. And as every sectoral ministry or coordinating authority on water knows, this is an extremely challenging agenda. Let me also say a few words about the way that the water sector can contribute to climate mitigation. This is really important. First of all, rice cultivation is a major contributor to greenhouse gases, in particular methane and nitrous oxide. It is also possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by increasing energy water use efficiency. It is possible to reduce methane emissions in the sanitation sector and also to promote the circular economy by reusing these methane emissions. More and more, it is important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through multi-purpose storage that also incorporates renewable energy, such as you see here, floating solar panels on a reservoir. And finally, fighting deforestation and promoting reforestation where appropriate is a very important way that water, which is needed for these forests to grow and thrive, can contribute to greenhouse gas emission reductions. Let me say a few words about rice, because rice is so important in countries like Thailand and indeed throughout Asia. It is the main food staple for half of humanity, but it occupies a lot of land. We love the beautiful photos of rice terraces in Asia. What we don't see in those photos is that paddy contributes a huge amount of methane and nitrous oxide emissions. Why? Because mostly when the rice residue is flooded permanently throughout the year, there is a decomposition of organic matter under conditions of lack or absence of oxygen, and that causes methane. But in addition, countries like to burn the rice straw after the harvest, and that creates lots of emissions plus foul air in many, many places. Hanoi is a famous example of that. In addition, there is excessive use of fertilizers, and that causes the production of nitrous oxide. And so look at this picture here. If you manage better your fertilizers, if you do better irrigation, if you improve energy efficiency, if you improve residue management, if you reduce the amount of loss in drying, in the processing of rice, drying, milling, and the logistic, you can very, very significantly reduce carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions, in addition to saving energy, to cleaning up local air, and saving money, which also is very important because the farmers who grow the rice, they need to see a difference in terms of their monthly income. And so we believe that there is a very, very significant agenda here when it comes to water, air quality management, and climate action in the rice sector. Finally, on climate change, needless to say, water is key for adaptation, be it through managing increasing hydrological variability or coping with disasters. And this slide gives an idea of the types of measures that should be undertaken, covering things like doing better cost-benefit analysis of the measures to prevent problems. We need to be better economists. That is the short message. We need to improve the efficiency of water use and manage better the evapotranspiration from the irrigated fields. We need to combine better gray and green infrastructure to protect ourselves against floods and droughts. It's not just about concrete, it's also about nature-based solutions. Land that can let the water infiltrate, coral reefs, mangroves, these are all natural barriers that protect the economies and societies against climate events. Increasing water shortage of storage, obviously, for the dry days. Investing better in models, in insurance, in early warning systems, and obviously rebuilding better and retrofitting the existing infrastructure. And if I may just conclude my presentation with two slides that focus a little more on Thailand, since we are in Thailand. Well, unfortunately, I'm not, but I am with you virtually. A word on climate action in Thailand. As you may know, and if you don't know, then it's important that you do know that, unfortunately, Thailand's nationally determined contribution, the version that was published in 2020, is not sufficient in terms of the country's contribution to meeting the Paris Agreement goals of global warming control. And that's why it's been called critically insufficient vis-a-vis the Paris Agreement goals. The good news is that the Prime Minister at COP26 in Glasgow just a couple of months ago pledged a very significant new action, and including reaching carbon neutrality, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2065, if I'm not mistaken. This is a wonderful, very welcome pledge. As I said, it's a long-term pledge, and what Thailand needs to do is very quickly now reduce its emissions so that this net zero objective can be reached. In addition, Thailand has declared the biocircular green economy model as a forward-looking strategy, and if I understand correctly, this model is now going to be the main agenda of the APEC meeting of this year. And then finally, and I promise this is the last slide, as we heard from His Excellency, the Privy Councillor, water resources management has been a core pillar of the royal development projects in Thailand, including those promoted by His Majesty the King. And the government has devoted very significant resources to the water sector over the years, with an emphasis on increasing access to water across the sectors. And this approach has been successful in giving millions of Thai people access to potable drinking water, water to produce cheap and abundant food, and to generate hydropower. This, of course, is a wonderful development, but unfortunately, given everything that I've talked about before, we now need to recognize that water is a limited resource, and we need to manage it much more cautiously across a multitude of sectors that often compete, and of course against the backdrop of climate change, of supply side constraints, of quality deterioration, and wastage. And so it's quite interesting that the National Statistics Office of Thailand has developed this water management index, which you see on the right-hand side, and which shows really interestingly that water is critical for the fight against poverty. You see in the southern part of the country, where the number of the poor, the concentration of poverty is really the highest, you also see that that region, those regions do actually quite well with respect to the water management index. So it goes to show the correlation between good water management and poverty reduction. Of course, the institution that I represent here, the World Bank Group, stands ready to continue to support Thailand in thinking about the future of the water sector in all the dimensions that I have mentioned, including, of course, how to stimulate private sector in investments, and doing better across the board. So I wish to very much thank the organizers for this opportunity, and we stand ready with my colleagues who are here present, our country manager, Birgit Hansel, and our senior specialist, Shelley Macmillan, and many others to support you if there is an interest. Let me thank you very much for your attention.